begin promptly on time as per our chamber traditions. So good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for our third episode of Eye on the Economy. My name is Carla Nell. I'm President and CEO of the Burlington Chamber, and I'm delighted to be joined today by our friends from SB Partners. We have a terrific panel of experts organized today who are going to assist us and organizations across the community as we all work to adapt our operations to the effects of the global 19 pandemic. And certainly, I think it's fair to say that strong leadership and an effective business strategy has never been more important to future success. So we're looking forward to learning more today about how to build sound internal structures, great and strong business processes in order to help us not only with our continuity plans, but also to prepare for the future. And we have a wonderful panel of subject matter experts from SB Partners and SB Advisory who specialize in this area, joining us for today's episode, who are going to provide practical information on how to identify risks and, very importantly, develop mitigation strategies to succeed in a post-pandemic world. It's my pleasure to introduce John Chisholm. He's a partner and CEO of SB Partners. John is
Carla froze up.
It was I wasn't sure if it was me or Carla.
I think it was Carla.
Organizations, and presently John is serving as campaign cabinet chair with the United Way, Hamilton Halton, and he's also chair of the YMCA, Hamilton, Burlington, and Brantford. Our second expert this morning is Ramki Balakrishnan. Ramki is well known for his proven track record in turning around businesses and making them valuable and profitable. He has been advising CEOs on corporate performance, mergers and acquisitions, strategic planning and management, change management, finance, sales, and corporate software solutions. Very important in a digital era for more than 21 years now. And then finally, it's my pleasure to welcome Greg Clark. He is one of SB Partners' foremost resources for assurance and advisory services. Within Greg's portfolio, he has expertise in international accounting, corporate and investment banking, and that is very fundamental to his practice area. He has a background in finance, and he gives clients insightful feedback on developing financial protocols, as well as ensuring that business leaders have the information and practical solutions and advice they need in order to make informed decisions. So with all of that said, thank you everyone for joining us this morning, and I look forward to hearing from our friends at SB.
Great, thank you, Carla. Thank you for inviting us, and this is a very timely event, and as we discussed it earlier, who knew where we would be at this point? And obviously we're clearly in the second wave. So our hope this morning is that we can share with you some leadership thoughts on how to navigate this, some strategy, and Greg's going to dive into a little bit more practical tactics for you to leave today with a bit of an action plan. So if we go to my first slide, I think it demonstrates for us what we're experiencing. So on the left-hand side, pre-COVID, we were all trying to manage change. And if you think of change, it can be exponential, it can be quick. But when managing change as a leader, you're kind of really trying to monitor three hard trends that you want to understand. And those three hard trends are technology, demographics, and regulatory issues that may face your business. Those are very predictable trends. And the only one of those that really changes at that exponential level is technology. So even pre-COVID, we were experiencing change at that exponential rate with technology and how to adapt and adopt technology to change. On the right-hand side, disruption. We're in the midst of a global pandemic, so we're being swirled around. So that is a very disruptive degree of the environment that we're working in. The pandemic has been an accelerator of change, and it's been an accelerator in the adoption of technology. So an acronym that came out of the 2008 economic crisis is VUCA. And that was actually an Army U.S. Army College acronym, which stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So clearly, in operating through a pandemic, we're in a VUCA world and a VUCA environment. So our skills and ability to adapt to this environment are quite different. Ambiguity, obviously, because we're right now trying to monitor all the changes through the pandemic and what stage are we in. So we'll hear tomorrow from the Premier as to what changes might occur in our region, in our city, that we need to adapt and change to. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So it really does require a different set of skills to manage this VUCA environment. So there's 4 identified skills. This really came from a Ready Now leadership study, and it was a global study. So anticipating, introducing, and managing change. We were thrust into this, obviously, by the pandemic, but to be a bit more anticipatory is a strategy to manage change. A good book on that would be The Anticipatory Organization by Daniel Burrus. And Daniel Burrus is a futurist. So that would give you some background in how to be a bit more anticipatory in your business strategy. Building consensus and commitment within your team, within your organization. Inspiring others toward a more challenging future vision. That is, again, a leadership skill necessary right now to lead through this change. But also leading across generations and mobilizing people around a shared purpose. It's the first time really in history that we are operating with 4 generations within our business platform, within our client or customer constituency. We have to be aware of what motivates those 4 generations. Again, another book I'd recommend, Start With Why by Simon Sinek, might be helpful for you to understand mobilizing people around a shared purpose. We can go to the next slide. So how do we now, oops, sorry, right there. So how, what are the attributes of being a future-ready leader? So again, providing direction where you know the future is going. Again, understanding a VUCA environment, there's not a lot of clarity. There isn't a lot of stability. Old measures that we thought were fairly stable are not as stable as they were pre and post-COVID. Setting context, I think that's really important for leadership, to set context for those so they understand clearly what the vision and direction is, but their role contextually to support that vision and direction. Facilitating learning, hugely important in this environment. As we adapt and adopt new technologies to operate through a pandemic, continuing to learn to operate in these new environments is hugely important. And inspiring your culture. So understanding your culture, the values that bind your firm together, your organization together, that's going to ensure that you've got support in setting that new direction and operating through crisis. Also enabling innovation through collaboration. I think an example of that is the speed by which vaccines for COVID-19 have been developed. That's global collaboration that has resulted in unprecedented innovation and speed of change in scientific breakthroughs. I think one of the most important attributes is a disciplined degree of execution. That's going to make or break your ability to cope with change, but also set and manage through unprecedented and ambiguous environments. So the other part of this was, how do you actually align and be prepared for your digital future? Even pre-COVID, this was a huge trend. So this is really driven from a Deloitte and MIT study that was completed in 2016. So, obviously, number one differentiator is your culture. So getting the right people, right mindset, and right skill set. But again, these are leadership attributes that will serve you through this digital evolution. So again, transformative vision, setting that that clear vision, understanding your market trends, business acumen. You need to be a problem solver. We're all faced with that today. Forward thinking, again, clear, a sound strategy, which Ramke will talk about, and again, foresight. Understand technology, that's a requirement today. New establishment is 2020 has become 2025 as it relates to technology adaptation. You need to be change-oriented, open-minded, adaptable, innovative, agile. Again, strong leadership skills such as being pragmatic, focused, decisive. That's again, those disciplines that are necessary to navigate through this change. And collaboration is hugely important in being a team builder. So to then kind of get to the next slide, to really now set this up for Ramke, I'm leveraging on the work of Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great. And it's one of the concepts from Good to Great for companies in his study. He looked at Fortune 500 companies. Through his analysis, he really found 11 of those Fortune 500 companies that moved from good to great in a sustainable way. Part of the attributes that serve those companies well is the hedgehog concept. So it's really, again, the Venn diagram, the three concentric circles, starts with what are you deeply passionate about? What can you be the best in the world at? And what is also going to drive your economic engine? So this is really where all of those align together. You're going to find your sweet spot. So the basis of your hedgehog concept, if you can't be the best in the world at it, it can't form the basis of your hedgehog concept. This also plays to that degree of discipline. And in Good to Great, Jim Collins also talks about the culture of discipline to support that hedgehog concept. And also the concept of level 5 leadership, the 5 levels of leadership. So I would encourage you to read Jim Collins' Good to Great, and I have a few other recommendations of books that might be helpful as you flesh out your strategy and the discipline of operating through crisis. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Ramke to dive a bit more deeply into establishing your strategy.
Thanks, John. That was a very good introduction and segue to strategy, because I'm a big believer of forming companies that will last, and strategy is the backbone for it. I'm a big fan of Jimmy Collins, and I've read this book multiple times. But more importantly, in strategy, you talked about discipline, and there's one other factor I will add to it, which is called timely execution. Because procrastination can be a devil, and strategies are often, revisited many times because it's never done, properly for the first time. As I always say, 5 blindfolded people touching an elephant. People, define strategy differently, and the mindset of the organization who are at the helm of making decisions will have to be of the same mindset to form a strategy. So strategy is all about what is your vision and where you want to be, and essentially looking at how do you differentiate ourselves from the industry and our competitors. So it involves people, and it also involves defining where we want to be. So according to the philosophy, the management philosophy, you fill the bus and then decide where you want to go, in which direction you want to go. So strategy is all about, looking at the future and defining that path and ensuring that, are we going in the right direction, and we have the right people and capital to sustain and achieve the results what we have expected. Also, it defines, what is our mission? Why do we exist today? And also where we want to be in terms of vision and what values drive our organization. And this dovetails into defining the culture of the company. Do we have the right mix of leaders? And strategy is all about people. It's prepared and thought by people and executed by people. So it is important, and we will see in our next slide, that you need to have the right mix of leaders in order to execute a strategy. Do you have the right people also involved in those strategy discussions? Participation and leadership by participation is the way that the future has seen. And it is important to recognize at this point that people who are participating in strategy have a mindset that digital first is one of the strategy, or it's the oxygen of the organization in the present pandemic world. People have migrated from a traditional way of running business to more digital form. And when I say digital, it's sustainable digital transformation, where you're talking about an enterprise level ERP solution or enterprise level business intelligence application. It also involves building capabilities. Understanding capabilities and capacities is very important as you build your strategy. And last but not the least, as you're building capacities and your capability, you have to understand the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat. In the modern world, at least since March, I've changed my thought process is strengths, opportunities, and pandemic, because I cannot differentiate what is a weakness and what is a threat in the present world, because things change on the fly. So we're going to the next slide. The starting point for strategy is identifying the organizational chart, looking at who's driving what. So I often say, it doesn't matter where you are in the organization, what you drive in the organization is very important. So identifying these 3 levels and who will be participating in the planning and execution of a strategy is very important, because people who are designing the strategy will also have to ensure that it's executing properly. So there are 3 levels in any strategy formation or planning session, which is one is corporate level, who are primarily responsible for financial performance and corporate image, brand, relationship, and social responsibility. So they define and they are responsible for how a corporate is seen or an organization is seen from that standpoint. The second level is the business level. This is the most critical piece of any strategic planning or execution, because these are the people who will be executing the plan, take the idea from the corporate level and break it down and looking at the SMART goals, making it more practical to achieve and explaining it to the group who will be executing it on the objectives of why we are getting into a strategic session is very important. So they'll be responsible for executing the planned strategy. They'll convert the strategy into operational plan and objectives and set goals for the business units or the functional managers. We'll see on our later slides how this is connected between a vision to a key performance indices. And most importantly, which I'm a big believer of, is the culture of the organization and designing some good HR practices. Because when we pose challenges to people, it has to be done based on a relationship, and that relationship forms the backbone or basis of how organizations work. And the last but not the least and most important level is the functional level, because they are the people who are, again, goes back into the culture, who will give feedback back to the corporate level saying that, the strategy is not going to work because of certain factors or certain metrics that you overlook. So it is very important that a corporate level or a business level leader is understanding that we can take feedback and we can stand corrected. And that's a very important aspect of forming a strategy. Going to the next slide, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threat. These are some of the examples, but as most of you may know, strengths and weaknesses are internal factors and opportunities and threats are external factors. It's very important that when corporate level or business level people are thinking about SWOTs, they think about it in 2 levels. One is at an organizational level, how the organization is exposed for these things, and also looking at individual functional levels, like what is my SWOT for sales function, and how are we going to mitigate our risks, how are we going to talk about addressing our weaknesses, and how do you reinforce your strengths and opportunities. So you'll see later in the later slides that Greg is going to present on how you can do an assessment. But in this exercise of SWOT is very important. And as you're understanding SWOT, I've seen organizations where more than 40–50% of the revenue is allocated for human resources capital, like labor cost. But there are 0 initiatives around strategy for talent engagement and development, or there's no enough resources to manage that particular resource. So as you're thinking through it, digital first, human first are very important as you analyze your SWOTs, because when people leave, they take away talent, they take away engagement, motivation, everything from with them. I'm not talking about the bad apples, I'm talking about the good apples. So it's very important that organizations will have to understand there is a SWOT around human capital, there's a SWOT around technology. And people are migrating from more traditional on-prem applications, systems to digital. At SB Advisory and SB Partners, we have put digital first as our approach in terms of resolving or looking at a solution. So these are some of the areas where you can actually think about doing a SWOT analysis. Go to the next slide. And we jump into the next acronym, which is called Objectives and Key Result Areas. So there's an objective and there's a key result area. So how are we connecting these two dots? As everybody knows, mission and core values are the starting point for an organization. And these are sometimes defined well, sometimes they are not, at least to our people who are working with the organization. So when you look at the hierarchy, it's actually starting from the mission and core values and then goes down to vision. So vision essentially talks about what is our desired state of future, where we want to be. And this often is very important, and it can be revised as you are progressing in a very uncertain VUCA world, as John mentioned. And then you design a strategy to address or to look at where you want to be. And last but not least, you look at the objectives. So what's the objectives that we want to achieve and how do we measure them? The key result areas is how strategy is measured and tracked for success or failure. So it is very important that this is embedded in, not in a Word document, but in a living document or through your systems and processes. So we go into the next slide. The overall objective of OKRA is to see what you want to accomplish, which is your objective, and how are you going to achieve these things. So when you look at it, you define key result areas within your organization. This is where I see that, okay, my strategy is a success or a failure. And how do you measure it is through embedding this into your dashboards using balanced scorecards. And there's a big knowledge base around it, but essentially you're talking about three milestones of key result areas. Where were you, to where you are, to where you want to be. So it's important that you understand the numbers behind it and how you are trending. Are we progressing? So not essentially that every number you see a progressive trend is good for the organization. It's a bad metric. So understanding the objective, why an objective is set, and with a positive or a negative trend, we have to set it up in the system. And designing the tools, which is ERP or Power BI, using budgets and forecast and key performance indices or metrics, is the way how you track whether the strategy is a success or failure. So you leave traces of those metrics flowing up to the top, which is mapped to a strategy document through dashboards. So according to Lord Kelvin, if you are able to express certain things in numbers and you are able to measure it, then you know something about it. If not, the knowledge is that of a meager. So it's a very interesting quote, and there are qualitative metrics and there are quantitative metrics. So if you look at on the next slide, you'll see that this is an example of sales function. So if you want your organization to achieve a 30% year-on-year growth, and that's part of your strategy, so how you're going to achieve is, maybe as an example, you can say increasing your customer base, increasing your average order value, or shorten the lead time for coding so you get more orders in the system. And how are you measuring it? What is your initial KRA? Like you had 100 customers to where you want to be in the future. And that can be 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, or 5 year. Strategy is not about the term. It's about how you're progressing and how often you want to revise your strategy. And designing balanced scorecard. And there are 4 important perspectives I wanted to mention here. An organization should be focused on at least 2 of these perspectives. So traditionally, people have always been focused on the bottom line or the financial metrics, but there are some organizations who have focused on customer or internal processes or employee satisfaction or engagement and growth. And those organizations also have progressed, and they've also met their financial strategic targets. And giving a good definition of where your organization is focused on strategy will help you design, all the other business objectives. And that can be communicated to your customers, and they will appreciate it when they know that you are an employee-focused company or you're a customer-focused company. And designing the tools to say, okay, my budgets are set up that way that I can track these metrics and tag it back to see whether did we grow our sales by 30%. So this is a sample example, and more than happy to answer any questions. But if you're going to the next slide, this is not my quote. This is of Glenn. Strategic thinking, innovation, and adaptation will become even more important qualities of business leaders, policymakers, and and the public in the world, where disruption is frequent, widespread, and is a recurring reality. So with that, I'd like to hand over my next slides to Greg.
Thanks, Ramki. So for the purposes of this part of the presentation, I wanted to lever off a tool that we have at SB Partners called the MORE program, and that stands for Managing Opportunity and Reducing Exposure. It's a diagnostic tool that we use to help clients in building their business. And I wanted to share parts of it with you to be able to allow all the participants on this meeting to learn more about different ways on how they might look at their business to help it grow and make it stronger. So if we go back to the beginning of the pandemic, on March 11th, 2020, the business community reacted because of a public health declaration for the global pandemic. We didn't think we would ever have to deal with something like this. And I remember even 2 days after this declaration, I was driving home. It was Friday the 13th, ironically. And I was starting to hear about all the closures of the rec centers and things like that, and thinking to myself, like, what is happening here? It's something that nobody ever planned for or thought would necessarily happen, but here we are. So as businesses reacted to that change, there were basically 4 business cycles that they moved through. So initially it was the triage stage, assessing what is happening, what business processes are important to my business, are critical to keep going as we try to figure out, what are all these changes happening back in March as things are closing down and there's these new rules that are in place on how we have to operate, and trying to understand things like what is social distancing and what do we need to do to protect our team, protect our customers, and ensure, the viability of our business. Then, we started to, as we learned more and businesses started to get more comfortable and understand the rules, we moved into the mobilization and adaptation stages to really say, okay, what adjustments do I need to do to my business to ensure, the operations and deliver the goods and make sure that I'm adhering to all the new rules. But at this point now, at the, sort of 8 months after the declaration of the pandemic, we're moving into a state which we're sort of referring to as evolution. So evolution really is the ability of the company to adapt to its environment to ensure its survival. So I think we can all agree, based on where we are and where we've come from over the last 8 months, business as we know it is going to change going forward. How we operate, maybe the structure of our business is going to look entirely different than it probably did pre-COVID for a lot of businesses out there. So if I think back to how a lot of business owners really focus on, determining the success of their business, a lot of them would really focus on the income statement. So, they would come in and they'd look at their sales figure or their profitability for the year and say, okay, it went up 10%, and they'd be high-fiving each other and all happy. And that is a barometer of success, but it's not the only one. And to really determine the health and strength of a business, there's other things than just profitability. Profitability is key. I don't want to, discount that. But in order to ensure a strong business, you have to look at other things. And some items that you want to maybe consider is things like systems and processes. So those are, you know, what are your operating procedures? How does your business work from day to day? How do things flow through the system? That provides efficiencies and structure to the business to allow that it's operating effectively, and to also mitigate errors and issues that may resolve in the business and provide strength to the business. Second, cash flow. I've seen lots of businesses that, you know, have had a year where they're very profitable, but their cash flow is very, very low. And especially in a time like we're in now with the pandemic and a lot of different stressors on businesses, cash flow is extremely important. And understanding what affects cash flow and how you can improve cash flow is very important. We'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. Tax planning. Nobody likes paying taxes. It's sharing to a degree, it's sharing a portion of your profitability with your unwanted partner up in Ottawa. But there's tax planning that you can do to ensure that you're not paying more than you need to, and that you're paying your fair share from a legal perspective and not overpaying to government. And that's always a key aspect for any business owner, to make sure that you're properly structured and that you're paying the right amount of tax. And then my last point here really is contingency planning. So what plans do you have in place to really ensure that your business has contingency plans for things that pop up? So pre-COVID, whenever we talked about contingency planning, it was usually around things like a fire at your business or a flood. And how would you operate if all of a sudden, you couldn't go in the doors of your business? We didn't plan necessarily for a pandemic. But now it's on our radar, and we have to start thinking from that perspective as what can impact the business and how would we respond when that occurs? Because at the end of the day, major events will highlight the weaknesses in your company. So when we look at diagnostic from a business perspective, I want to sort of make the analogy back to sort of going to your doctor for your annual checkup. You walk into the doctor's office, you sit down, and your doctor will, typically look in your throat, look in your ears, check your blood pressure, listen to your lungs and heart, maybe send you for some blood work. They don't necessarily know at that time if there's anything wrong with you, but they're checking different aspects of your physical health to determine whether something doesn't look right. And when you're talking about that from a business perspective, you can do it from the same perspective of it's important to look at your business on a regular basis and assess, does everything look right, or do I need to make some changes to ensure that I have a healthy business? So when we talk about things like manage opportunities and reducing exposures, I want to sort of walk through some key areas that I think that we feel are really important for you to consider. So when we're talking about opportunities, the things we want to, consider is things like government programs. And obviously over the last, 8 months, government programs have been a highlight, for the economy out there in terms of the various wage subsidy programs that are out there. Obviously, a lot of business took advantage of it, and I'm sure a lot of people on this presentation today have enjoyed the benefit and support of those programs. And I'll come back to some of the current programs that are in place in a moment. But even pre-COVID, there were a lot of government programs that were in place that businesses may not necessarily have, realized. Two very big ones that were out there was the Scientific Research Experimental Development Tax Credit Program and the IRAP program. Those were used by a lot of businesses, but you need to also be aware that on a regular basis, many different levels of government introduce programs that could be either industry-based, age and stage-based, or regional-based to provide additional fundings to companies to help them grow. So it's important to really look at different government programs, tap into those, and really see how you can take advantage of those opportunities. As mentioned in my previous slide, tax planning is always a big thing. It's not necessarily as easy as just paying your tax bill. Within the Tax Act, there are, depending on what you're doing, there are different opportunities to avoid paying tax on a legal basis if you do things the right way. The government allows that. And it's determining where you're going, what you want to do, and really look at how to get there in the most tax efficient manner. Business processes and technology. This is a key thing to look at. As you look at business processes and you hone those processes, you can gain efficiencies, which will typically turn into additional profitability. But I think what we've also seen over the last 8 months is the role of technology and how we operate our business. Technology, such as Zoom that we're using today, is critical for a lot of businesses to have kept them operating. But I think we're also identifying that technology will also become a key point as we move into the future and how we deliver our services or goods to our customers, even post-COVID. Business development, I think the key there is when you look at it from a diagnostic perspective is what might you be missing from a business development point of view? How can you build more market share? What could you do differently to develop business? And that could be new sales channels, that could be new services, products. How can you lever on the customer base you have and sell more? Business succession planning. So every business should be started with the end in mind, in the sense that as you build this business, you're going to eventually want to sell it in most cases. Usually, just walking away and closing up the doors at the end is not necessarily a way to really capitalize on what you built over your career. So business succession planning could look like something like passing it on to a family member, could be selling it to a management group, or could be selling it to a third-party competitor. But what's crucial, even if you're a younger business, is to determine what might my succession plan be, and then revisit that on a regular basis to see how that's actually working out as your company develops. As with all small businesses, it's not just the business. As an owner manager, the business plays into your personal financial planning. So we always have to integrate that with the business overall. So it's important to start the process of personal financial planning to ensure that you're in the right spot to meet your retirement goals in the future. And your business operations and success of the business, especially as a private business owner, will be key in satisfying your personal financial planning and your goals for the future. When we look at estate planning, we're really talking up there about, how do we pass on as much of our estate when we pass away to those that we wish it to go to. So typically speaking, that might be, your spouse, kids, but it could also be other people in your life. So with anything, estate planning is key to sort of consider how that would look and how that is being done in a tax efficient manner to ensure that you're leaving the most behind. And then financing is another key opportunity. You need to look at the financing structure of your company and determine, do you have the right financing in place to ensure it can meet your growth goals moving forward? Now, when we look at reducing exposure, we want to look at things like corporate risk management. So those are policies that companies have in place to determine how to mitigate potential losses and risks in the future. So, have you considered in your business all the various risks that are impacting your business, and what your plans are to be able to mitigate all those risks to ensure that none of those really come back to have a major effect on your business. Cybersecurity and risk management. Cybersecurity has and will continue to be an area of risk to businesses. I'm sure if my own experience is anything like anybody else's here on the call, I've been getting a tremendous number of emails where, click the link and people trying to get into your system. And you always have to be aware of ensuring that cybersecurity is intact and that you're not allowing, the wrong person into your network to potentially steal your IP, your customer list, private data, things like that. And I don't see that trend changing in the future. I think it's actually going to expand, and cybersecurity will become more and more key as we move forward. Business continuity planning. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, that's really having the plans in place should an event occur to ensure the continuity of your business, and not having a plan in place raises a huge amount of exposure to every business. And estate and succession planning, I mentioned it on both sides. It was on the previous slide. And that's really, it is an exposure in the sense that if not done properly, you can end up actually paying too much in taxes and not actually having enough left over for your plans after your business is over, or passing on to your beneficiaries. So what we want to do is sort of break it down a little bit, and I have some items here that I think are key for people on the presentation today to start considering in their business. So, how do you ensure that your business is new normal ready? So, has your business prepared to, for the remote working environment? That may seem like a bit of a silly question 8 months into the pandemic, but as recently as last week, I was actually speaking with a prospect, and they had not done anything to move into a remote working environment. And here we are today, potentially with, some significant news coming out tomorrow from the Premier that may have significant effects on how businesses operate. And maybe it's a lockdown, maybe it's not. But I still look at what I'm seeing out there, and not all businesses have really done what they've needed to do to be able to operate on a remote basis with all their team members at home. A lot of businesses have done a great job, but not entirely across the board. Have you also considered how you would move to a more digital environment for your operations? Again, a lot of companies have done this successfully, but not everybody. And it's not just a matter of how you're delivering your product or delivering your service, but it's also how your paper flow within your office. So pre-COVID, you might have had different forms of different things moving around the office for approval and things like that. If you're working in a remote work environment, you're not in a position anymore to be able to have that paper flow in the office to various people. And you need to ensure that how are you going to transition that physical paper flow to more of a digital environment so that you can continue the operations of your business. Have you considered the effect of another lockdown and how it may impact your business? Obviously, depending on what type of business you're in, a lockdown can have a tremendously significant impact. But you need to consider, are you operational in a lockdown environment or are you not, depending on your business? And, if there is a complete lockdown, are you in a position to still continue providing your operations? Another key one that I think is important for people to sit back and think about is what would be the effect if you had an employee that got sick, and how would that impact your operations? So if you got a phone call tomorrow from one of your employees saying that they tested positive for COVID-19, how would that affect the operations of your business? Can you actually, keep going? Do you have the right things in place to be able to support the business if you had an employee that got sick, or even worse, if you had multiple employees? And lastly, the key one is the supply chain. So is your supply chain, secure in the sense that are you able to continue to ensure that you're going to have the flows of goods or services as inputs to support your business operations? You may have a certain supplier that you're using 100% of the time. Has that supplier done what they need to do to ensure their operations? So if something bad happened to them, that it's not going to necessarily impact your operations, or do you have other suppliers that you could tap into should something happen? So I think at the end of the day, contingency planning really is key. So what's important when you're looking at this is focus your thoughts on what could go wrong in your business. What's critical? What are the risk factors? Always think with questions like, what if? What if my employee got sick? What if my supply chain was interrupted? What if is an important thing to ask, because that will lead you to the areas where you have to concentrate from a contingency planning point of view on how you're going to deal with those particular issues. Next thing that's important is looking at key performance indicators to track and determine when to implement changes. So as business owners, we should all have key performance indicators to sort of measure and manage our business. In the current world that we're in now, those key performance indicators may change slightly. You may want to look at different things besides just sales, profitability. You may want to look at aging of accounts receivable, for example. You may want to look at your backlog as an indicator of how much business do you have looking into the future. And then as those key performance indicators change, they may provide you clues as to where the business and the local economy is actually going. And then as you go through that, you want to develop your secondary action plans or contingency planning to implement if a critical event does occur. But the one thing to be clear about is contingency plans aren't something that you just prepare today and you put into a drawer in case something happens. They are something that needs to be dynamic and needs to be reviewed often in the current environment, because things are changing so quickly that you need to change those plans as more information comes out or more changes come out, and adjust accordingly. And the other key thing, getting back to, the what if scenarios, that what if that employee becomes sick, is ensuring that your team is cross-trained, I think is really critical. Again, if you lose somebody because of illness or whatever the situation may be, you want to ensure that other people can step into their, position and ensure the operations of the business. Financing and cash flow. So this is critical. So looking at your business, asking yourself the question, do you really have the proper financing structure in place for your business? Things like lines of credits, proper term loans to support long-term assets. Those are things you want to look at to determine whether the financing structure meets your needs today and meets your needs over the next, 6 months in particular, in my mind, because, as we move into the winter, it's going to be important to ensure that the financing structure is there. The other thing to consider too is what reserves might you have to fund operations. So those reserves could come from, personal funds that the shareholder has that, is available to inject in the business if need be. It may be reserves that come from other businesses that you own, like a holding company or another operation that you may have. And, do you have enough to fund operations? Cash flow is critical. As I mentioned, as we move through into the winter with the increased number of COVID cases, at the end of the day, there is a saying that cash is king, and that's important to ensure that having that cash flow will definitely assist you ensuring that you can keep the doors open as we move through this. So a few things just to consider when we look at cash flow and how you can impact that. So one thing to consider is pre-billing. So, if you're the type of operation that traditionally has just sent out an invoice as you provided the service or provided the good, can you change that up a bit and start asking for a retainer or deposit for goods and services ahead of actually providing those? The other thing to consider is how can you, possibly accelerate your billing cycle? Again, if you're a type of company that provides services or goods during the month and then you typically, invoice at the end of the month, how can you move up that invoicing period and maybe have the invoice done at the same time as you provide the service or provide the good? Again, the sooner you get that invoice into the hands of your customer, the sooner it's into their accounts payable system and hopefully gets paid faster. And how can you increase your collection cycle? There's a few different tricks there. Some businesses honestly don't manage their collection cycle as well as they should. And some don't actually start the collection cycle till too far in advance. And especially in the situation where we are today with the pandemic, waiting 60 days until you contact an accounts receivable asking for payment may be a little too long, and you might have to look at things like, can you start making those phone calls a little sooner to try to facilitate getting the payments in and improving your cash flow. And lastly, the important thing is really to consider how do you, look at your credit policy. So what is your credit policy for providing accounts receivable, to your customers. You know, are you providing too much credit? Should you limit the amount that you provide to some of your customers? You may want to look at it from a customer to customer perspective also, and knowing that, you know, certain customers may be in a very strong position right now and other customers may not be, and you may not be able to necessarily extend them as much credit. And then also just looking, you know, strategically at your customer base to see, you know, are there any ones that are at potential risk and that you really should maybe potentially consider billing and asking for payment before providing your service or product. So government programs. So just a few points here. The Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, very popular program that I'm sure a lot of people in the presentation today have taken advantage of. So that has been extended and is continuing on until June of 2021. The rules and the calculations are changing somewhat. So the amounts that maybe you've been getting historically up to now may be a little less than, you know, going forward, but that subsidy and that support will still be there. Another thing to consider, which, you know, may not necessarily be known across the board, is early on in the pandemic, one of the early responses by the government was to provide 10% temporary wage subsidy. And the concept there was business owners would do their typical payroll run, and instead of sending the whole amount of the source deductions to CRA, they would short them by 10% and send the 90% to CRA and keep the other 10% as a subsidy for operations. Right now, you need to ensure that you file a specific form called a PD27 that CRA is requesting. And by filing that form, what it will do is CRA will credit your payroll account to ensure that they've got the proper numbers to match up with what the T4s should have when filing. And lastly, one thing to consider that, you know, many people may not be aware of is if you took advantage of the Canada Emergency Business Account. So that was, you know, initially the $40,000 loan that could be taken that as long as you repaid it by December 31st of 2022, then $10,000 of that loan it was or is forgivable. One thing to consider, the forgivable portion of that loan is actually taxable in the year of receipt. So if you did receive that loan this year, you have to just be aware that that $10,000, that is the forgivable portion, is coming into income for tax purposes this year. So some other considerations that are important for you to look at is, you know, as we moved from a, you know, an office-based environment or workplace environment to more remote. You may have all your team members working at home or a portion of your team members working at home. You have to consider, you know, what the effect of those changes may have had on processes in your business, and in particular, fraud risk. Fraud risk, you know, we have different processes and procedures that are in place to identify issues and prevent fraud risk. But as we moved quickly into a remote environment, those processes and procedures may not necessarily be working as they intended to. And it's important to look at those changes to see, do you need to tweak anything to ensure that your company is not exposed? Cybersecurity, as I mentioned earlier, cybersecurity has increased and I feel will continue to increase. And we have to ensure that you've got the proper systems and protection in place to keep all your data and information secure. One thing the pandemic has highlighted is the accelerated pace of change. It's just been unbelievable since March, just how fast things can change. And we need to understand how that affects, you know, each of your particular businesses, but how you will also adjust going forward. And the other effect to consider too is protectionism. So, you know, that's the idea of, and we've heard a lot of talk about it, you know, mainly from the US in terms of Buy American, but it's not also the US. The same thing's going on in Canada and also in Europe, where countries are looking to say, okay, buy locally, you know, support your local businesses. And if you're a company that traditionally has operated in the global environment, how could that impact your business? And, you know, again, what changes might you have to do to combat some of those environmental changes that you're operating in? So I think at this point, I'll turn everything back over to Carla.
Thank you so much. I honestly, what a wonderful presentation. I feel that we have all had the benefit of attending a masterclass in business strategy today. And regardless of whether or not we're a leader in the public sector, the private sector, or the nonprofit space, you've provided incredible and timely insight to help us really respond to the disruption we're all dealing with a great sense of purpose and clarity. So I do have a question I'd love to ask all of you, because we talked about the importance of business strategy, and you made it very clear that that is essential to success moving forward. One of the things I'd love to hear from you about is, and we often hear this, is that, you know, organizations build strategic plans and they don't live them. They end up sitting on a shelf, or John, as you put it earlier in the week when we were chatting, they become credenza aware, which is a terminology I absolutely love. So how do we as business leaders, if we're going to invest this time and ensure that we maximize it, that we actually live it, and that it becomes that roadmap for success that you've touched on?
I guess I would just say, Carla, it does get back to that level of discipline. So it requires a degree of discipline to embrace your strategy across the spectrum. And as Ramki alluded to, that needs to be embedded in your dashboard and your whole reporting cycle, that your strategy is clear, it's documented, and that you are tracking and reporting on the metrics. And as I think, I don't want to speak for Ramki, but it is those qualitative and quantitative KPIs. Your information. I think Ramki, that plays a little bit to the need now to manage your data in a live way versus that older traditional sense of waiting for these reporting cycles and looking at it. It has to be more live.
Real time, yeah.
So there is, as Ramki indicated, a number of ERP, which is enterprise resource planning tools that can be used, and they don't have to be, you know, hugely expensive systems to implement for small to medium-sized business. There's many tools, QuickBooks Online and other applications that can support that. So that's mere.
So thank you for that. And do you have any advice about sort of what's the optimal time frame for a business strategy right now? You know, historically, strategic plans have in some cases even been developed anticipating goals that are 5 years ahead. Obviously, with so much uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity and volatility, as you described earlier, it's very difficult to predict. So, you know, is in today's environment, is it 1 year? Is it 3 years? Is it 3 months? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I see. I'm going to hand it to Rand, but so I'll give you some of my experience through the YMCA movement and that federation. Most large urban-wise now are operating on 4-month cycles because we need to adapt to changes in the environment and the communities that you're operating in. So businesses now, it's more those short cycle changes because the environment that we're operating in. But I think, you know, Ramki, you would kind of look more to your like an operating plan to support that maybe longer term strategy is equally as important.
Yeah, so you know, strategy is generally the B word. You know, they say strategy that, oh, okay, that's 5 years. But, you know, when you talk about strategy, there are short-term and long-term strategies. And, you know, we should not mix up operational targets with strategies. Essentially, you need to, like, the team will have to be motivated to say that, yes, if you're getting into a car and going to a destination, are we prepared for it? Do we have the food, supplies, and people in the car? Do we have gas? So talk about certain important aspects of strategies like finance and people. They're the oxygen of the strategy. So it's a constant evolution. So as I said, strategy is not about like taking a position in the future. It's a continuous process. I hope that explains, like, strategy is a living document in my world.
Thank you so much for that. We've run out of time today for the formal component of today's presentation. I want to thank you, John and Ramki and Greg, very, very much for joining us today. Some wonderful insights that you've shared, and we really value SB Partners as a key partner to the Chamber and our many members. So thank you so much.